In order to gain a greater insight into the discussions of Saugus and Revere, the Clearing the Air initiative has chosen to seek out those from inside and outside of both communities that have been involved in discourses pertaining to incineration in this, the Breath of Fresh Air series. The first interview of this series is with Katie Lajoie of Charleston, New Hampshire. Katie was one of the main community activists responsible for the closure of the Claremont Wheelabrator Inc. in Claremont, New Hampshire. Katie has been an activist against Wheelabrator for about 26 years until its closure in 2013. Hopefully this video will give you a greater insight into how to frame discussions pertaining to incineration in a productive and inclusive manner.
My name is Katie Lajoie. I live in Charlestown, New Hampshire. I'm a registered nurse. I've worked for many years with the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services, and I do want to say that I am giving this interview as a private citizen and not as a representative of the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services. It happened in the mid-'80s when there was a public announcement that there was a plan to build an incinerator. One of the hearings I went to featured Dr. Paul Conant. He's a former chemistry professor at St. Lawrence University, and he gave a talk about the dangers of dioxin and how dioxin is created by incineration. And when I went to his talk, I came away thinking this incinerator project will never go anywhere because it's really obvious that this isn't good for the environment or for the community. However, the incinerator project did go forward. Right from the get-go, it was very controversial because the way that the contract never went to a public vote. The public voted to join these waste districts, but they never voted to enter into a contract with Wheelabrator. As it became apparent the onerous nature of these contracts, I and a lot of other people were saying this is not good for the community. We realized that the way it was being framed by the regulators and the industry was skewed in favor of incineration. We were saying you can't prove this is safe, and that right off there was a lot of controversy about the pollution and about financial entanglements with Wheelabrator, and that controversy never abated. One is the negative impact on the image of a community that is a host community to the incinerator industry because they're waste disposal target. There were some environmental reports done by the state. They did say that mercury and dioxin in area ponds and lakes, some of it was attributed to local sources. And they also said that the incinerator was the largest single stationary source of airborne pollution in Claremont. We do know that the state's report on air quality in Claremont, they did find the levels of 7 toxic chemicals exceeded what are called cancer risk evaluation guidelines. We also had a professor from the Harvard School of Public Health peer review the state report, and he did find problems with their methodology and their conclusions. But basically, the conclusion that also going on at the same time has been extensive research on toxic emissions from smokestacks in general. Oftentimes, the incinerator industry will talk about that, the incinerator meets all standards. And we've stated that these standards are not health-based. According to the Inspector General, the Clean Air Act of 1970 required the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate air toxics based on risk to public health. However, the EPA could not clearly define a safe level, so they said it's almost impossible to issue regulations. And so there was amendments to the Clean Air Act in 1990, and at that point, the focus shifted to technology-based standards. So the industry got to set these standards. So we know that these standards do not protect public health. One of the basic things about incineration is that it increases the risk of exposure to toxic chemicals because pollutants are released in air and ash, and they're released on very tiny particles that are easy to be inhaled or ingested. The prestigious International Joint Commission, which looks at water quality in the Great Lakes, said that pollutants that are bioaccumulative and persist in the environment, such as lead, dioxin, mercury, are too dangerous to be released in any quantity, and that we really need to get away from this idea that we can have numerical end-of-the-pipe standards for these chemicals. It's a lot of times people hear from the incinerator industry, we're meeting all standards, and yet their brain says, well, how can it be safe if you have dioxin building up in the soil? Certainly lead and mercury, they're elements. They don't magically go away. They just continue to build up. This is called a toxic loading. And in Claremont, in 2006, 35 local healthcare professionals issued a statement calling for closure of the incinerator, saying that it's an unacceptable and unnecessary risk. When they closed in 2013, the towns quickly shifted to an alternative routes. The incinerator was never a success in terms of public acceptance. There was another very big thing that happened that caused a lot of people being upset with Wheelabrator. That had to do with the electric contract. Incinerators like Wheelabrator burn materials and they create electricity. Here in Claremont, there was an onerous utility contract where Wheelabrator was able to charge a very high amount of money for the electricity they sold to the utility. The Public Utilities Commission found out that Wheelabrator was overcharging the public. They were allowed to sell high-priced electricity, but they were selling too much of it. And the Public Utilities Commission said that the public had been overcharged and a refund was due. We became involved in the hearings before the Public Utilities Commission, and we did an analysis of how much the overcharge was, and it's in the range of $12 to $14 million, around there. And that was accepted as a proper assessment of the overcharge. And Wheelabrator and the utility ended up coming up with a stipulated settlement that whittled down the refund to $800,000 and allowed Wheelabrator to continue on as usual. And that didn't settle well with the public, because the public really did get overcharged massively. Wheelabrator made a lot of money on the electric sales. When you look at all the public hearings, when you look at the organizing that was done to oppose permits, etc., there has always been, and there continues to be, a strong dislike of Wheelabrator. Wheelabrator is a multinational corporation. They were owned by Waste Management Inc. They're a big player on the national scene. And what happened here, you have these lobbyists in the state capitol, and they have lawyers. Those people exert influence on public officials, especially on municipalities that don't have multi-million-dollar law firms. Wheelabrator also would present to public officials the great financial windfall that they might get. Public officials in these smaller communities may not have the time to read all the fine print, or may be too much influenced by what they're perceiving as the strong legal and financial power of a multinational corporation. When you talk about discussions that don't rise to the public purview till after a while, that certainly happened here. As I said, that by the time the public hearings started happening here about this project, there was already a lot of groundwork that had been laid. There was a Vermont legislative investigation in the 1990s. It had to do with what did happen when entangled in this contract with Wheelabrator. The public was circumvented. The contract didn't go to a public vote. What that did was saddle the public with a long-term debt because of the put-or-pay nature of the contract. Something like that is really long-term debt. Some of the public officials who were involved getting this incinerator ended up testifying for the legislative committee. One of them did say, we didn't want to put it to a public vote because we knew it wouldn't go through. They don't test the total toxic content, the total amount of lead, just how much might leach out in a 24-hour period. But even that, they did fail that. In the air testing for dioxin, for example, if they pass, then it's considered representative of what's really coming out the stack. If they fail, they get a chance to keep retesting until they pass. So a failure is not considered representative of what's really going on. Pass is, and then you keep testing until you pass. Wheelabrator, for many years, secretly was burning these used filter bags. They're part of a smokestack control. The more aggressive your attempts are to reduce air emissions, the more toxic the ash becomes, because it gets collected in these smokestack filters, and then that just gets put in the ash. So the ash has always been considered Achilles heel of the incinerator industry. What they were doing at the incinerator, and didn't tell anybody for 15 years, they were shaking down the filter bags to collect the fly ash, but these bags were also still coated with this fly ash, and they were burning these. They burned thousands of them, and they got caught, and then lo and behold, we found out that they claim everybody does this. When they tested these filter bags, they were found to be hazardous. This ash pile is a risk forever, and even if you have lined landfills, there's obviously the risk that they will breach at some point. And the problem with ash is that they're minute particles that can easily get into the groundwater and surface water. Now, my understanding is a place like Saugus is in a marsh. Yeah, I mean, that's incredibly dangerous. This changed because we had looked at the data and found that after they put retrofit equipment on, that the dioxin emission rate increased hugely, like about 1,200%. We were at a hearing in Concord and we're talking about this, and the state representative came in and he said the data are not right because Wheelabrator mislabeled the column of the dioxin emission. This went on for years. So according to the state, the dioxin emissions increased 143%, not what we say here. We used this data based on what we later found out to be mislabeled documents. I mean, that raises a whole host of questions. What else was mislabeled? But even the state saying the data was mislabeled, the state has admitted that after they put in this equipment to supposedly reduce dioxin emissions actually increased 143%. It shouldn't be created. If the public is challenging the ash in Saugus, you really need to challenge where the ash is coming from. I would encourage the city to plan for alternatives and to look at a closure plan for the incinerator. The incinerator industry will often say that incineration reduces the volume of waste. You can get those same reductions with aggressive composting, recycling, and reuse. You just get rid of incinerators, you don't have the ash, you don't have the pollution, you don't have the controversy. I believe that people care about the quality of their water and air, but people don't get told the truth a lot. Or issues get framed in a way that kind of skirt around the truth. And one of the biggest examples is this thing about standards, and we meet all standards, but they want the public to believe that means that it's safe, and it's not. And so sometimes the public believes state said it was okay, it was safe. You have to keep reframing the issue for members of the public. It's just a goal for me to get people away from thinking that waste is an automatic part of life and that we have to make things and throw it away. And that's been inculcated in our brains for a long time. And in fact, when Wheelabrator first started out, that was one of their sales pitch. You've got to get people thinking that waste is a verb, it's not a noun. A material has a lot of value to it, and it's not waste until it's wasted.
Thank you for watching the first interview in the Breath of Fresh Air series. We hope that this video was informative and gave viewers an insight into the complexities of incineration. Special thanks to Pierce Lewis and the Lewis family. Find us on Facebook at Clearing the Air Initiative or by emailing us at clearingtheair2015@gmail.com. Next in our series of interviews, we will be interviewing incineration activists from California who dealt with similar issues pertaining to incineration plants as Saugus, Revere, and Claremont.